Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another Discipleship Debrief. This past Sunday, CBC Youth was continuing in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we had a smaller passage this week, but we were taking time to really look at the preacher's contrasting of worldly perspective and worldly understanding of things and a eternal perspective and eternal understanding of things in a small section that's actually spurred on in the preacher's thinking by watching wicked people die. It's really interesting. The preacher, as he's writing this, almost gives us a peek into his writing process, because the very first word of this section is, "Then I saw the wicked buried." I saw the wicked buried. And so he's showing us that he's looking objectively at the lives of the wicked. And what he does as he looks objectively at the lives of the wicked and the lives of the godly is he contrasts the frustrating things we see when we have a worldly perspective with the hopeful things that we see when we have eternal perspective. So starting with that worldly perspective, and this really shows how dangerous a worldly perspective can be for us as Christians and how frustrating it can be for us as Christians. Because the preacher points out first and foremost that the wicked were people who were celebrated in the house of God and were praised by people. And that can be a really hard concept for us as Christians when we see wicked people celebrated and praised and treated as holy, really, in a sense. That can be really hard for us. I told a story of having a coworker who was actively cheating customers, and when I told my bosses that he was cheating customers, they didn't do anything. And after a while, rather than doing anything, they started celebrating him because he was getting record numbers for the store. And that's a small scale illustration of just how frustrating it is to know someone is doing something wrong and to see them praised instead of receiving consequences. And so from a worldly perspective, where we're expecting worldly, tangible, physical consequences instantly, oh man, that is frustrating. Right? And the second phrase that the preacher talks about in this small section is he says that an evil deed, the sentence against an evil deed, is not executed speedily. And what he's talking about there is not crimes or punishment, but rather the sentence for sin, the penalty for sin, which we know from Romans is death, right? And so the preacher's pointing out that we don't see earthly, tangible, physical consequences for sin play out very quickly. And because of that, he says, the children of man go on sinning. They feel like they're untouchable in their sin. And again, as Christians, how frustrating is this for us, right? How often do we find ourselves crying out for God's justice, crying out to see consequences for sin? And if we're not careful, like Psalm 73 with Asaph, if we're not careful, we start to say maybe sin isn't so bad. And maybe the wicked people have it right. Maybe we should be like them because they seem to be prosper. So that's the danger of a worldly perspective, is because we're expecting worldly, tangible, physical consequences that we don't always see, it starts to deteriorate our view of God and his justice and his standards and all these different things. And ultimately, even if we avoid those things, it just frustrates us. It makes us angry, vindictive Christians. And so that's why this passage isn't about a worldly perspective. The preacher is by no means advocating for a worldly perspective. He's advocating for an eternal perspective. And we see that as he changes his tune and he notes that even if a sinful person prolongs his life in his sin, he will die, and it will be well with those who fear God. Ultimately, there's no getting around the fact that it will one day be well for those who fear God. And this is the hope of the eternal perspective, is that even when we don't see things on our timeline operating how we want them to operate, we have a promise from God. And if the one who promised us something is eternal and unchanging, then the promise itself is eternal and unchanging. And so whether it be through actual tangible means now, or one day in the ultimate future, it will be well with those who fear God. And that's something for us to cling to for the rest of our lives, even as we see the frustrations of this world, even as we see people living in their sin, doing fine. We need to cling to that reminder that, no, it will be well for us who fear God. And the preacher's closing remark then echoes kind of the start, where he started by watching the wicked be buried. And he says, it will not be well with the wicked. And this is a hard concept for us, but an important concept for us, that no sin will go unpunished. Sin will not go unpunished, and justice will not go uncorrected, right? If you read the end of Revelation, it says that God will wipe away every tear, right every wrong. There will be justice. So when we find ourselves looking at situations in the world crying out for justice, we can be reminded there will be justice. And as Peter says in 2 Peter 3, for God to delay that justice is ultimately mercy, because we are results of God's delayed justice. Because if he cast out justice on sin instantly, none of us would be believers. We would all be dead. And so we are results of God's mercy in delaying his justice. And so we, as we see God delay his justice on the earth, can note that he is merciful all the more. So, for you, as parents and guardians in the home, as you follow up this week, ask your student, pretty simply, how can you fight against a worldly perspective this week? What can you do to combat a worldly perspective this week? And honestly, it's probably going to be pretty practical, right? Depends on how much time your student is spending comparing themselves to worldly or wicked people, right? If your student's like, hey, I'm on social media 8 hours a day watching nothing but, Hollywood celebrities, and saying, well, if they can do that, why can't I do that? Wow. And they need to do a lot to fight back against a worldly perspective, right? But it's not always that obvious either. Sometimes it can be that they're comparing themselves to their friends, saying, well, my friends are doing this thing and they're not seeing consequences, and that starts to erode their eternal perspective as well. So ask them that question. How can you fight against a worldly perspective this week, and help them to do that? Just a reminder that next week is Easter, so we will not have youth group, but we are cooking breakfast for the entire congregation. So if your student is able to help, please let me know. It was a wonderful time last year. I'm sure it'll be a wonderful time again this year. Looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to being back to youth group in a couple weeks. If you have any questions or thoughts for me in the meantime, please let me know. Otherwise, see you next time.